The conference room went completely silent when the man in the charcoal grey suit looked directly at me and asked, "Mr. Carter, before we discuss the restructuring loan, could you tell us why your wife's parents are waiting outside your office?" For a second, I didn't answer. I simply looked through the glass wall toward the reception area where two familiar faces sat side by side, dressed in expensive clothes that no longer looked expensive enough. Richard Holloway. Margaret Holloway. My father-in-law and mother-in-laws. The same two people who had once laughed at my parents because they couldn't afford designer clothes for my wedding. The same people who believed that a bank balance measured a person's value. Neither of them had any idea that the man they had come to beg for financial help from was the same son-in-law they had spent years quietly looking down on. I smiled. Not because I wanted revenge. Because life had a strange habit of arranging conversations at exactly the right time. But this story does not start here. Welcome back to Revenge Cold Stories. Drop your first name and your city in the comments and subscribe before we go any further. My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 38 years old, and for most of my life, I believed something my father repeated almost every Sunday evening after dinner. "People can count your money," he would say while washing dishes with my mother, "but only your character counts when nobody is watching." At 8 years old, I didn't understand what he meant. At 38, those words explained almost every important moment of my life. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, in a two-bedroom house that measured just under 1,200 square feet. My father, Thomas Carter, worked as a maintenance technician for 34 years at the same manufacturing plant. My mother, Evelyn Carter, spent 26 years working as a school cafeteria employee. Together, during my childhood, they never earned more than $72,000 in a single year. We didn't own a vacation home. We didn't travel overseas. The newest car we ever had was already 4 years old when my father bought it. But every bill was paid. Every promise was kept. Every neighbor knew that if they needed help moving furniture, repairing a fence, or watching their children for an afternoon, my parents would arrive before anyone else. That was their wealth. Most children don't recognize that kind of fortune. Neither did I. When I was 10 years old, our elementary school organized a parents' career day. Doctors wore white coats. Lawyers arrived wearing tailored suits. Business owners drove luxury cars into the parking lot. My father showed up wearing steel-toe boots with paint stains that refused to come off no matter how hard my mother scrubbed them. I remember pretending to tie my shoe so I wouldn't have to walk beside him immediately. I wasn't embarrassed by him. I was embarrassed by what other children might think. Years later, I confessed that memory to him. He laughed. I noticed. That surprised me. "You did. Of course. Weren't you hurt?" "A little." "Then why didn't you say anything?" He smiled exactly the way fathers smile when they already know the lesson life will eventually teach. "Because one day you'd understand without me explaining it." He was right. I understood. Just much later than I wish I had. School came easily to me. Numbers made sense. Patterns fascinated me. While other students memorized formulas, I wanted to know why they worked. I graduated second in my high school class of 286 students. A local scholarship covered part of my tuition. I worked 27 hours every week during college at a warehouse, loading trucks from 6 in the evening until midnight. Most semesters I slept barely 5 hours a night. By graduation, I had earned a finance degree with honors and accumulated less than $12,000 in student debt. To some people, that wasn't impressive. To my parents, it felt like winning the lottery. My mother framed my diploma before I even found my first job. She hung it in the hallway where visitors couldn't miss it. Not because she wanted to show off. Because she wanted everyone to know that hard work had reached somewhere she never had the opportunity to go herself. My first position paid $52,000 annually. 3 years later, I earned $71,000. After another 4 years, I crossed 6 figures. By the time I turned 35, I was leading acquisition teams responsible for evaluating businesses worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Ironically, very few people outside work knew any of this, especially not my future in-laws. I met Emily Holloway at a charity fundraising event organized by one of our clients. She wasn't like the image people usually imagine when they hear wealthy daughter. She listened more than she spoke. She volunteered every Saturday at an animal rescue center. She remembered the names of waiters. She apologized when someone else bumped into her. Money had paid for her education. It hadn't replaced her manners. That difference mattered. We dated for nearly 3 years before I proposed. During those years, I met her parents dozens of times. Richard Holloway was 62 when we married. He had built a regional commercial construction company, employing nearly 400 workers. He respected achievement, but only the kind achievement that produced visible symbols. Luxury watches, large homes, exclusive clubs, expensive vacations. If success couldn't be photographed, he struggled to recognize it. Margaret Holloway, 60 years old, had never officially worked inside the family business. Her influence operated differently. She measured social standing with extraordinary precision. She remembered who wore last season's fashion, which neighborhood someone lived in, which college their children attended, who sat at which table during charity galas. To Margaret, society resembled an invisible ladder. Her mission was making sure the Holloways never stood below anyone else. Neither of them considered themselves cruel. That made everything more complicated. They genuinely believed they were helping people understand how the real world worked. In their minds, status wasn't arrogance. It was responsibility. My parents confused them. Thomas and Evelyn refused to compete. They thanked restaurant servers by name. They bought practical gifts instead of expensive ones. They never pretended to be richer than they were. Richard interpreted that as lack of ambition. Margaret interpreted it as lack of refinement. Emily saw something entirely different. She saw peace. One evening after dinner, she squeezed my hand beneath the table while our parents discussed wedding plans. "I wish everyone could stop worrying about appearances," she whispered later in the car. "I know. They're exhausting. They're your parents." She sighed. "I love them. I know. But sometimes I don't understand them." Neither did I. Not yet. Looking back now, the warning signs were already there. When my parents first visited the Holloways' estate, my mother brought homemade peach preserves because she'd heard Margaret enjoyed them. Margaret accepted the jars politely. The following week, during another visit, I found all 6 unopened jars sitting untouched inside a pantry larger than my parents' entire kitchen. Not thrown away. Simply forgotten. That hurt my mother more than if they had rejected the gift outright. She never mentioned it. She simply stopped bringing homemade presents. My father noticed. He said nothing. That silence became familiar. Every family gathering contained tiny moments almost invisible to outsiders. Richard recommending investment clubs while ignoring that my father had no interest in joining. Margaret complimenting my mother's dress by asking whether she'd found it at one of those charming discount boutiques. People nearby laughed politely. My mother smiled politely. Only Emily and I saw the sadness hiding behind her eyes. Once after dinner, I apologized to my parents. "You don't have to keep coming." My father looked surprised. "Why wouldn't we? They make comments. They don't mean harms." "They do." He folded his napkin carefully. "Daniel." "Yes. When people are completely secure, they don't spend much time measuring everyone else." I thought he was defending them. Years later, I realized he was quietly explaining them. Our wedding planning lasted 11 months. Emily wanted a small ceremony. Margaret wanted elegance worthy of the Holloway family reputation. Richard wanted clients, investors, and business partners invited. The guest list expanded from 84 people to nearly 300. Every decision became a negotiation. The flowers, the orchestra, the reception hall, the menu. My parents contributed what they could. $7,000. It represented almost 18 months of savings. Richard insisted on paying the remaining balance without allowing anyone to refuse. At first, I appreciated his generosity. Later, I understood generosity sometimes arrives attached to invisible receipts. Those receipts eventually come due. The wedding itself was beautiful. Emily looked happier than I'd ever seen her. My parents cried quietly during the ceremony. Richard shook my hand proudly. Margaret hugged every guest. For a few hours, everything seemed perfect. Until the reception. Continue. The ballroom overlooked the river, its floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting hundreds of tiny lights from crystal chandeliers. Nearly 300 guests filled the room. The orchestra played softly while waiters carried silver trays between tables covered in white linen and fresh roses. For the first hour, everything unfolded exactly as planned. Emily and I greeted relatives. Friends from college laughed over old stories. Business associates congratulated us. My parents stayed near the edge of the room, exactly where they felt most comfortable. They never liked being the center of attention. My mother kept smoothing the sleeves of the navy blue dress she had bought 3 months earlier after visiting 6 different stores. She had insisted on paying cash because she hated debt, even for something she would probably wear only once. My father wore the same black suit he had purchased for my college graduation 12 years earlier. It had been professionally cleaned. The shoes were polished until they looked almost new. To me, they looked dignified. To someone else, they apparently looked inexpensive. I noticed Margaret watching my parents several times throughout the evening. Not with anger. With quiet calculation. As though she were mentally comparing photographs that didn't belong in the same album. Then came the moment that changed everything. The master of ceremonies announced that both families would gather near the stage for a formal photograph. Guests stood and moved closer. Cameras flashed. People smiled. While everyone arranged themselves, Margaret stepped beside my mother and gently touched the sleeve of her dress. "Evelyn," she said with a pleasant smile that barely reached her eyes, "perhaps you and Thomas would be more comfortable sitting with the extended family in the back after the photographs. Most of Richard's business partners will be joining us at the front tables." My mother blinked. "I'm sorry." Margaret laughed lightly, as if explaining something obvious to a child. "It's simply about appearances." There was a pause. Just 2 seconds. But I still remember every heartbeat. My father spoke calmly. "We're happy wherever Daniel and Emily want us." Richard walked over before anyone else could respond. He smiled at several guests standing nearby. "I think Margaret is only trying to keep everyone comfortable." Then he looked directly at my father. "Some people understand formal business settings better than others." The sentence sounded harmless. Unless you knew exactly who it was meant for. A nearby couple exchanged uncomfortable glances. Someone quietly looked away. Emily squeezed my hand so tightly I could feel her nails through my jacket. "What did Dad just mean?" she whispered. I didn't answer. Because I already knew. Richard wasn't talking about seating arrangements. He was reminding everyone in the room which family had paid for the reception. My mother forced a smile. "Oh, wherever you think is best." Those words hurt more than the insult itself. Because she truly wanted to avoid creating a scene on her daughter's wedding day. Then something happened I'll never forget. A waiter accidentally brushed against my father while carrying champagne glasses. One glass tipped over. Champagne splashed across father's jacket. The young waiter immediately apologized. I'm so sorry, sir. Before my father could respond, Richard sighed loudly enough for several nearby guests to hear. That's unfortunate. Margaret looked at the stain. I suppose that's why darker suits are practical. A few people laughed. Not because the comment was funny. Because wealthy rooms often reward the person with the highest status. Even when they're wronged. My father smiled at the frightened waiter. It's only a jacket. He took a napkin himself. No harm done. He spent more time comforting the waiter than worrying about his own clothes. That was who he was. Emily suddenly stepped forward. Mom. Margaret turned. Yes. I'm sitting wherever Daniel's parents sit. The room became strangely quiet. Margaret's smile froze. Emily. No. Her voice stayed calm. If they're moved, we're moved. Richard's jaw tightened. This isn't the time. I agree. Emily nodded. So let's stop discussing it. For one hopeful second. I thought the conversation had ended. Instead, Margaret leaned toward Emily and whispered words that were quiet enough to sound private, but loud enough for my parents to hear. My dear, you married into a wonderful man. She glanced briefly toward my parents. Not necessarily into the same social circle. I saw my mother's smile disappear. Not dramatically. Not with tears. It simply disappeared. Like someone quietly blowing out a candle. I wanted to say something. Every instinct inside me screamed to defend my parents. To confront Richard. To tell every guest exactly how many nights my father had worked overtime so I could attend college. To explain that my mother's hands had permanent scars from decades of kitchen burns. To remind everyone that dignity isn't purchased. It's earned. Instead, my father gently touched my arm. Just once. Barely enough pressure to notice. I looked at him. He gave the smallest shake of his head. Not now. His eyes weren't angry. They were protecting me. Protecting Emily. Protecting the wedding. So I stayed silent. That silence would confuse my in-laws for the next 6 months. Because they mistook restraint for weakness. The reception continued. Music played. People danced. Photographs were taken. Champagne flowed. To every guest looking from across the ballroom, it appeared to be a perfect wedding. Only 4 people knew the truth. Emily, my parents, and me. Late that night, after nearly everyone had left, I found my mother removing her shoes in the hotel lobby. Her feet were swollen. She smiled when she saw me. Beautiful wedding. I'm sorry. For what? You know. She looked toward the empty entrance before answering. Daniel. Yes. Don't let tonight become the memory you keep. They insulted you. They embarrassed themselves. I stared at her. She continued quietly. When people need to remind others they're important. She smiled sadly. They're usually trying to convince themselves. Those words stayed with me. Not because they erased the pain. Because they changed it. The following Monday, life returned to normal. Or at least it appeared to. Emily and I settled into married life. My parents went back to work. Richard returned to expanding his construction company. Margaret resumed organizing charity events and society lunches. Everyone behaved as though the wedding reception had been forgotten. It hadn't. Some wounds don't bleed. They simply become part of the way you look at people. About 3 weeks later, something unexpected happened at work. Our CEO announced he was retiring 18 months earlier than planned. The company's board had already begun discussing a complete leadership restructuring. At first, I didn't think much about it. I was one of 11 senior executives. Experienced. Respected. but certainly not the obvious favorite. I had no idea that the decision being made inside boardrooms over the next few months would eventually bring Richard and Margaret Holloway to the reception desk outside my office, asking for help from the very man they had quietly considered beneath them. Continue. The announcement barely caused a ripple across the office that morning. Most people assumed the board would hire someone from outside the company. That was the pattern. When organizations reached a certain size, they often believed leadership had to arrive wearing an unfamiliar face. I wasn't interested in office politics. For the previous 9 years, I had built a reputation for something much less glamorous. I solved expensive problems. If a subsidiary was losing money, I analyzed it. If an acquisition looked risky, I challenged it. If projections didn't make sense, I was usually the first person willing to tell a room full of executives that they were wrong. That habit earned me respect. It also earned me enemies. People enjoy honesty until it interrupts their plans. During those months, I was traveling constantly. Chicago on Monday, Atlanta on Wednesday, Dallas the following week. I spent more nights in hotel rooms than in my own home. Emily joked that she recognized the sound of rolling suitcase wheels better than my footsteps. Still, she never complained. Instead, every Sunday evening, she packed homemade snacks into my travel bag because she knew I hated airport food. Whenever I thanked her, she'd smile. My grandmother always said love isn't measured by big speeches, it's measured by little routines. She was right. Those little routines kept me grounded, while everything else became more complicated. Around the same time, Richard Holloway's construction company began making headlines. At first, the news sounded positive. He announced 3 major commercial developments worth nearly $180 million combined. Business magazines praised his ambition. Industry analysts called him one of the region's fastest-growing developers. Then interest rates climbed. Material costs increased. 2 investors unexpectedly withdrew. Projects that had looked profitable on paper suddenly became dangerously expensive. None of this was public knowledge. Not yet. Richard continued attending charity galas. Margaret continued hosting elegant dinners. Their photographs still appeared in society magazines. Success has an interesting habit. People notice it immediately. Its decline usually happens quietly. Emily sensed something before anyone else. One evening, after visiting her parents for dinner, she came home unusually silent. "Everything okay?" I asked. She nodded, then shook her head. "I don't know. What happened? Dad barely ate." "That's unusual." He kept checking his phone. "And your mum?" Emily hesitated. "She asked whether your company was still expanding." I looked up from my laptop. "Did she?" Emily nodded slowly. It felt strange. "Why?" "Because she's never asked about your work before." That caught my attention. For years, Richard had treated my career like background noise. He knew I worked in finance. He knew I had become successful. But he never asked details. Titles interested him only when attached to famous companies. Now suddenly, questions had appeared. A week later, Richard called me directly. It was the first time he'd phoned me without Emily involved. "Daniel." "Richard. I've been hearing impressive things." "About what?" "Your company. We've had a good year. I'd love to have lunch." That sentence surprised me more than anything else he'd said. Richard never invited people to lunch unless business was involved. We met the following Thursday. He chose the city's most exclusive private club. During the meal, he spent nearly 40 minutes discussing the economy. Interest rates, commercial lending, corporate restructuring. Only near dessert did he finally ask what he really wanted to know. So, he stirred his coffee casually. How involved are you these days with executive decisions? I answered honestly. Quite a bit. He nodded thoughtfully. I figured as much. Then he smiled. You've done well for yourself. It sounded like a compliment. But there was something different about it. For the first time, he wasn't speaking down to me. He was evaluating me. When lunch ended, he shook my hand more firmly than usual. We should stay in closer contact. Driving back to the office, I couldn't stop thinking about that sentence. Not because I distrusted him. Because it felt unfamiliar. Respect offered after years of quiet condescension often arrives carrying another purpose. 3 weeks later, the board called me into a confidential meeting. 7 directors sat around the long walnut table. The chairman closed the door himself. We've reached a decision. I assumed they were announcing the new CEO. Instead, he slid a folder toward me. Inside was a contract. I looked up. I don't understand. We'd like you to become Chief Executive Officer. For several seconds, I honestly believed they were joking. Me, the maintenance worker's son. The boy who had once been embarrassed by his father's work boots. The man whose parents had quietly accepted humiliation at his own wedding. The chairman smiled. We didn't choose you because you're the loudest. Another director continued. We chose you because every difficult decision over the last 5 years has eventually landed on your desk. A third director added softly. And every time, you've protected the company instead of your own reputation. I sat there speechless. Not because of the salary. Not because of the title. Because I suddenly wished my father could hear those words. When I called him that evening, he answered on the second ring. Everything all right, son? I've got some news. There was a long silence after I told him. Finally, he laughed. Not loudly. Just warmly. I guess they'll need a bigger nameplate. I laughed too. You know what I'm most proud of? What? You never forgot who you were while becoming someone. Those words meant more than every congratulations I received that week. Emily cried when I told her. She wrapped her arms around me and whispered. They finally saw what I've always seen. We agreed not to announce the promotion publicly until the board completed the official transition 6 weeks later. Very few people knew. The board, a handful of senior executives, Emily, and my parents. No one else. Certainly not Richard or Margaret Holloway. Meanwhile, Richard's company was running out of options. Banks had become cautious. Private investors demanded impossible terms. Cash flow tightened with every passing week. The confident businessman who had once believed money placed people above others was about to walk through the doors of my company. Convinced he was meeting an executive. Completely unaware. He was about to meet the new owner, sitting behind the largest office on the top floor. The official announcement was scheduled for a Monday morning. At exactly 9:00 a.m., every employee received the same email from the board of directors. By 9:07, my phone had already buzzed 23 times. Congratulations from coworkers. Messages from former professors. Old classmates I hadn't spoken to in years. Even the warehouse supervisor from my first job wrote, "Knew you'd end up running something big someday. Proud of you." I read every message. Then I put the phone away. Titles change quickly. Character shouldn't. My office had moved from the 8th floor to the executive suite on the 20th. The room was larger than my parents' entire first floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline. A polished walnut desk stood in the center. There was a private conference room, a sitting area, and a wall displaying photographs of every CEO who had led the company over the previous 74 years. When I first walked in alone, I didn't sit behind the desk. Instead, I stood by the window. I thought about my father fixing broken conveyor belts during overnight shifts. I thought about my mother waking at 4:45 every morning to prepare breakfast before leaving for the school cafeteria. Neither of them had ever worked in an office like this. Yet everything I had accomplished had begun because of them. That afternoon, I invited my parents to visit. My assistant arranged visitor badges. When they stepped out of the elevator, both looked completely overwhelmed. "This whole floor is yours," my mother asked quietly. I smiled. "It belongs to the company." My father looked around without saying a word. He slowly walked toward the window. For almost a minute, he simply admired the view. Then he turned toward me. "You know what I like best. The office." He shook his head. "The people downstairs." I laughed. "What about them?" "They're the reason this place exists." That was my father. Even standing in an executive office worth millions. He noticed the employees. Not the furniture. Not the view. The employees. Before leaving, my mother straightened the knot of my tie, exactly the way she had done on my first day of elementary school. "I know you're important now," she said. "But promise me something. Anything. Never make anyone feel small." I looked at her. "I promise." She nodded. "I already knew you would." Those words stayed with me. 3 days later, my executive assistant knocked gently on the office door. "You have visitors." "I don't remember any appointments." "They say it's urgent." "Who are they?" She glanced at her tablet. "Richard and Margaret Holloway." I felt completely still. Not angry. Not excited. Just still. Life had finally arrived at the conversation it had been quietly preparing for. "When did they schedule this?" "They didn't." "They walked in." "Yes. They insisted they knew someone in senior leadership." I almost smiled. "In a way. They do." She looked confused. "Should I send them away?" I thought for several seconds. "No, they don't know." "I know. Would you like me to explain your position first?" "No. Are you sure?" "Very." She nodded. "I'll bring them in." Outside the glass wall, I could see them standing. Richard looked older than I remembered. Only 6 months had passed since the wedding. Yet his shoulders seemed heavier. His expensive suit had been altered several times. I could tell by the stitching around the sleeves. Someone trying to save money instead of buying new clothing. Margaret still dressed elegantly, but her confidence looked carefully assembled. Almost fragile. The receptionist opened the executive door. They stepped inside. Neither looked directly at me. Instead, both searched the room. Richard spoke first. "We're here to meet Mr. Carter." "I know," I replied. He frowned slightly. "My assistant said he was expecting us." "I am." Another pause. "I'm sorry," Richard said politely. "Perhaps there's been some confusion." "I don't think so. We're meeting with the company's new owner." "That's correct." He looked around again. "I don't see him." I stood, walked around the desk, extended my hand. "You do now." Silence. Not dramatic silence. The kind that happens when reality arrives too quickly for the mind to reorganize itself. Richard stared at me. Then at the company logo behind my desk. Then back at me. Margaret whispered almost involuntarily. "Daniel. Good morning." Richard actually laughed once. A short, uncertain laugh. "I don't understand. I became CEO 3 days ago." He continued staring. "No, the board completed the transition Monday morning." His face slowly changed. Not into anger. Into realization. Every conversation from the past 6 months suddenly rearranged itself inside his memory. The lunches, the questions, the wedding, everything. Margaret quietly lowered herself into a chair without being invited. For the first time since I'd known her, she seemed unsure what to say. Finally, Richard spoke. I had no idea. I know. Congratulations. Thank you. His voice had lost every trace of effortless confidence. He reached into his briefcase and removed a thick folder. Our company is facing temporary liquidity problems. He chose each word carefully. We're looking for a strategic financing partner. I opened the folder. Construction forecast. Debt schedules. Cash flow projections. Everything was professionally prepared. I read silently for several minutes. The room remained completely quiet. No one mentioned the wedding. No one mentioned my parents. Not yet. When I finally closed the folder, I looked directly at Richard. This isn't a small request. I understand. The exposure would be significant. Yes. Our board will require complete financial transparency. He nodded. Of course. Margaret finally spoke. We're asking because we've exhausted almost every other option. There was no pride left in her voice. Only honesty. For the first time. She wasn't speaking from above anyone. She was simply speaking. I folded my hands on the table. I have one question. Richard looked up immediately. Anything. When you walked into this building today. I paused. What kind of man were you expecting to meet? Richard didn't answer. He couldn't. Because both of us already knew the truth. Continue. Richard looked down at his hands for several long seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded older than it had ever sounded before. I expected to meet someone important. I held his gaze. And now. He gave a tired smile. I've discovered I already knew him. No one moved. The air in the room felt strangely calm. There was no satisfaction in embarrassing him. The wedding reception had taught me something unexpected. Humiliation rarely changes people. Recognition sometimes does. I opened the folder again. Our credit committee will review every document. Richard nodded. I understand. There won't be special treatment because we're family. I wouldn't ask for it. There also won't be unfair treatment because of our history. That sentence caught Margaret's attention. She looked directly at me. You mean that? I do. For the first time since entering my office, tears gathered in her eyes. Not dramatic tears. The kind people spend years trying not to show. She whispered quietly. I don't think we've been fair to your parents. The room became silent again. Richard closed his eyes briefly. No, he said. We weren't. I remembered my mother smoothing the wrinkles from her dress before the wedding photographs. I remembered my father wiping champagne from his jacket while comforting the young waiter. Those memories would never disappear. But they no longer controlled me. I pressed the intercom. Claire. Yes, Mr. Carter. Please schedule a full financial review for Holloway Construction. I want legal, risk management and acquisitions involved. Right away. Richard looked surprised. You're actually considering this? I'm considering the business. He nodded slowly. That's fair. As they prepared to leave, Margaret stopped near the door. Daniel. Yes. I owe your parents an apology. I answered honestly. That's between you and them. She nodded once. I know. 2 weeks later, our analysts completed their report. The numbers were difficult but not hopeless. Holloway Construction wasn't failing because of dishonesty. It was failing because Richard had expanded too aggressively just before the market changed. There had been mistakes. Not fraud. The board approved a structured rescue package with strict conditions. The company would survive. But Richard would no longer control every decision alone. For a man who had spent 40 years believing control meant strength. That was the hardest part. He accepted anyway. A month later, my parents received an unexpected invitation to dinner. Not at an expensive restaurant. At Richard and Margaret's home. My mother asked me 3 times whether she should decline. "You don't have to go," I told her. She looked at my father. "What do you think?" He smiled. "If someone wants to make something right, we should let them try." That evening was unlike any family gathering we'd ever had. No business talk. No discussions about status. No comparisons. Richard personally opened the front door. He shook my father's hand and held it a second longer than usual. "Thomas." My father smiled warmly. "Richard. I've wanted to say something for a long time." My father waited quietly. "I'm ashamed of the way we treated you and Evelyn." No excuses. No explanations. Just the truth. Richard continued. "I spent too many years believing success made me better than other people." He looked toward me. "Your son taught me otherwise." My father shook his head gently. "No." Richard looked confused. "It wasn't Daniel. It was life." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then my mother walked over to Margaret. Without a word, she hugged her. Margaret began crying. Not because everything was suddenly perfect. Because forgiveness sometimes hurts more than punishment. Over the following year, things changed in quiet ways. Richard stopped introducing people by their job titles. Margaret began volunteering at the same community kitchen, where my mother served meals every Christmas. Not for publicity. There were no photographers. No newspaper articles. She simply showed up. Week after week. Emily noticed it first. "I think Mom's happier." Why? Because she stopped trying so hard to impress people. Richard eventually retired earlier than expected. When reporters asked about his proudest achievement, many expected him to mention skyscrapers or commercial developments. Instead, he answered, "I finally learned that the strongest foundations aren't made from concrete." Months later, my company celebrated its 75th anniversary. More than 600 employees attended. During the ceremony, I was asked to invite the people who had influenced my career onto the stage. Many expected famous executives, board members, investors. Instead, I called 2 names: Thomas Carter, Evelyn Carter. The audience applauded as my parents walked slowly toward the stage. My father's old habit returned. He looked slightly uncomfortable with everyone watching. I placed an arm around each of them. Then I said only one sentence. "Everything I've built stands on what these 2 people built first." The applause lasted almost a full minute. I noticed Richard and Margaret standing with everyone else, clapping harder than anyone's. Later that evening, after the guests had left, my father and I stood alone outside the building. The city lights reflected against the windows. He looked at me. "You kept your promise." "What promise?" "The one your mother asked for." I smiled. "Never make anyone feel small." He nodded. "That's harder than becoming successful." He was right. Money creates opportunities. Titles create authority. Recognition creates influence. But character determines what you do. Look,